Hi, I'm Josh Lovell, Product Line Manager for Teledyne LABS Pharmaceutical R&D Products. Thanks for joining our regular chromatography webinar series. Today's topic is focused on helping users build their achiral purification column toolbox with ready-set prep columns to use for different applications. As a reminder, if you have any audio-video issues, please exit the webinar and rejoin. This usually resolves the issue. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them into the questions box. Some questions will be answered at the end of the webinar, while others will be followed up after the webinar. The webinar will be recorded and made available for future viewings. We are excited to introduce one of our Teledyne LABS Global Chromatography Application Specialists, Todd Anderson. Todd is one of several application experts that we have at Teledyne LABS to help customers determine the best route to a successful separation. Todd's background in preparative purification for HPLC and SFC will be valuable for users trying to work outside the box for their separation needs. For any of your tough separation questions, please reach out to any of our experts with your questions. At this point, it's my pleasure to hand it over to Todd.
Introduction, and I'd like to welcome everybody to our webinar today for building your column toolbox. We're going to try and help you figure out the best types of columns to use, both for your reverse phase and normal phase separations, as well as some SFC work. We're going to go through a bunch of different things, and I'll get to that in a second. What we're coming across to you today is, are you having trouble achieving some elusive separations? Well, if you are, you can try using one of our ready-set prep columns. I like to start off webinars by giving a little bit of background information about me. I grew up with archery, and as you know, we just finished up the Olympics. Where I'm from here in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, we actually had the only two medals in the Olympics for archery. So I was kind of pretty excited about that, so I thought I'd throw this little picture in there for us today. But we can help you hit the mark. As you'll notice, there's a bunch of arrows right there in the middle, and then there's the one that's a little bit off to the upper right. That's kind of what I think of when I think of chromatography. It's you always are trying to separate that one difficult separation. A lot of them may be just normal, simple separations, but there's always that one that tends to be a little bit of a problem. And that's what we're going to try and focus on today, to try and get a separation on one or two of those compounds that you really can't get with traditional normal chromatograms. Today, we're going to be discussing a bunch of different chromatography types, mobile phase conditions that we typically run in chromatography. We're going to separate some of the chromatograms from both normal phase and reverse phase HPLC versus the SFC chromatography. And then we're going to do a compare and contrast a little bit on what we can see and what we can do with HPLC, whether it be reverse phase or normal phase, and how that translates into an SFC separation. Different types of chromatography that are out there. We're only going to focus on just a couple of them. Reverse phase, as I've already mentioned, and then we're also going to deal with supercritical fluid chromatography, SFC for short. Typical column uses for these different types of separations are going to be a little bit different. So normal phase, we usually use those for lipids, triglycerides, and a lot of major pharma compounds that are usually for bulk purifications. It's not usually as tight of a separation, something that you're just doing maybe intermediate or larger amounts of material. We'll do reverse phase HPLC when we want to try and get higher purities typically. It's a different type of chemistry going on the column and with the mobile phase. Then we also have SFC, which is a total new product for us within the past couple of years. We've just started into the SFC market, but we're doing a lot of really interesting work with it. And hopefully you guys can help us with the continuing in that trend. The other thing that I have down here is the HPLC. So HPLC is actually something that we're going to try and do a webinar on in the upcoming weeks, or I should say months. I'm not sure when it's actually scheduled for, but it's a totally different type of chromatography where it's sort of flipping traditional chromatography schemes. And we'll get into that more in that webinar, so I won't go into it here at all. Then there's also ion exchange, which is, I'm only bringing this in a little bit because we have a little bit of an ion exchange uh, portion of the new column that we're introducing with this webinar. So you'll see that in a little bit later, and it's called the ReadyStep C18 WCX column, and you'll see it here. Get into the stationary phase portion of the webinar. So we have normal phase stationary phases, which are typically going to be things like lumina, silica. Sometimes you'll put an amino column on there. They're usually flash chromatography is where I'm used to using them, but you can use them on traditional HPLC systems, and you can get hard packed columns in the normal phase as well. Typically, your solvents are going to be things like hexane and ethyl acetate or DCM and methanol, which are usually going to be organic solvents. When we go to reverse phase, typically you're going to have a more polar solvent and a non-polar stationary phase, like a C18, C8, and sometimes even down to a C4. That's just basically what we determine as a reverse phase column. They'll have different selectivities depending upon the porosity and the carbon loading of the actual silica, and it will affect the chromatography. So with those, you can always get a little bit of a different variation from column to column. But typically, the general phases themselves will perform quite similar from manufacturer to manufacturer and column to column. But usually, you use what you have in the lab. So if you have a C18, that's typically what people will use for reverse phase. If you have a silica column, they'll usually use that for normal phase. One of the hardest things to try and separate, because I'm used to doing reverse phase chromatography, is polar compounds. So typically they're going to come out in the void. It's really hard to sort of pull them out of the aqueous portion of your mobile phase. So as you can see here on the right-hand side, you can see that there's a little bit of a phase distortion where the phase actually collapses a little bit on itself when we get too much water into the mobile phase. So how do you combat that so that you can keep those stationary sticking out and actually like a bristle, so it helps you maintain that separation? One of the things you can do is you can put a little structure onto the siloxanes to help sort of make it stand up a little bit. It will also help prevent some of the water from getting down there and damaging the silica as well. But what you would typically do for me personally is instead of running acetonitrile or THF, maybe use a little bit of methanol instead. Typically, you can run about 45% methanol as opposed to maybe 35% acetonitrile. So it'll help pull your compounds a little bit away from the void of your injection. We'll also run very low and shallow gradients, maybe starting at 2%, maybe running 2 to 40% or 2 to 30% to try and pull things out away from the front of your column. There are other columns you can use as well. There's the C18AQ, there's the RP or other trade names across the industry, but we use it as the ReadyStep Prep C18AQ. And there's another column that I'm going to show you here in a little bit. You can also use a phenyl or an amino column, as I had mentioned before. Or you could do a little bit of both, where we actually change our mobile phase conditions around a little bit, and we actually run helic, where we hold the compound on the column and then reduce the amount of organic and go more towards the water, and it actually will do a reverse type separation. So as you can see here, this is a little bit more on that stationary phase like I was mentioning. So you're going to have the more polar compound or polar stationary phase down here at the bottom. So you have an amino column. Then we can actually start working our way up to phenyl and a cyano, and then we'll get to your traditional alkane stationary phases, which are quite hydrophobic. So that'll be like the C18, C8, and C4. And then as you can see here, we're going in decreasing hydrophobicity, but increasing on retention for nonpolar analytes. To our column offerings. So if you look on the right-hand side, I have a QR code here for you. If you want to go ahead and click on that with your camera phone, you can actually go ahead and pull that up on your web browser. But basically what you have is for flash columns, which as I mentioned before, are going to be your normal phase type columns, are going to be your Ready Set Gold. These are a plastic column that has the flash stationary phases in them. We can fill those with silica, amines, C18, C18AQ. I think we even have it a C8 online. Then I do most of my work with the AccuPrep HP150, so that's why I wanted to put those columns in here. And you'll notice that the second column right here is the C18AQ. That's the new one that I'm going to show some results with here in about 2 or 3 slides. But it gives us a little bit of a different affinity for certain compounds than the traditional C18. And then the WCX right here, which is also a new column that's sort of a hybrid column for us. And I'll show you that as well. We could use the C8 silica and diamine columns on the HP150, which is more of a reverse phase typical instrument, but we can actually switch over and do normal phase columns on there as well. But they would be hard packed columns in the stainless steel housing. The same kind of columns that we would be using on the HP150 typically go back and forth between the SFC, but as you'll see in a little bit, we will typically use a lot of different stationary phases, even though the columns may look and seem identical. We'll just have a different stationary phase inside of them. And just some of the mobile phase effects that you need to deal with. Everything from pH, as far as in this particular instance, just giving you a generic idea of why buffering and putting acids or bases into your mobile phase can be very critical to getting that separation you want. If you're running neutral compounds, usually it doesn't really make much difference. But if you do have something that's slightly acidic, as you can see in our diagram here to the right, if you have something that has a very low pH mobile phase, we're going to protonate that acid, and it's going to stick onto the column because it's not going to be as polar. If we have a moderate pKa, or the pH is close to the pKa of your compound, you might get a mixed mode separation where it might be protonated and some of it might be deprotonated. You could actually get a very smeared broad peak, and you'll see that in some of the chromatograms later as well. But if you have a very high pH and you don't really buffer your mobile phase, you could very easily get your compound pulling out in a void with your void retention. Just that's the way it is. So we try and make sure that we buffer the system you're going to be running. So how can we do that? Well, we'll improve peak shape by adding a pH modifier. Most of the time, most of our customers are using TFA, but there's other modifiers like acetic acid or formic acid is another big one that people will use. Formic tends to be more common for mass spec. TFA tends to form too much of a complex and reduces some of the ionization that I've seen with mass spec. The other thing you need to take into consideration is what are you going to do with the compounds after you get done doing the analysis. If you're just doing analytical runs, you really don't care about what you get at the end. You just want to make sure that you get a good separation and you can quantitate. If you're going to take this compound and then go on to do other types of studies, maybe you don't want that acid in there, maybe you want to have a free base. And in those cases, typically, if you're doing a TFA complex, you can form a salt. It's a little bit harder to get that off, and you may have to do some more processing after the fact. Again, I mentioned about some of the ionization issues with some of the modifiers you could use. Most importantly, we want to make sure that the modifiers you're using are compatible with the columns that you're using as well, whether it be chiral columns, reverse phase columns. Typically, most people don't buffer normal phase columns, but if you were putting something in there for that purpose, then you want to make sure that it's not incompatible with the columns that you're using. Somebody says don't mix acids and bases on your columns. However, I have actually done it in the past, especially if you're doing amino acids with chiral separations. And in those cases, what we typically do is it's not a very strong acid or a very strong base, and we're just sort of trying to work on both ends of a compound, for instance, like I said, an amino. So as I mentioned, we were going to introduce our new column, at least new to me, So we have the Ready Set Prep C18 WCX. As I mentioned before, typically when you have an AQ column or some sort of column that you're trying to work with polar compounds, you typically will have the silica and your C18, and then off of that same silica, you would have another R group coming off of that, or some other group that prevents the compounds from getting down into the siloxanes. In this case, what we've actually done is we've actually put a polar modifier on the actual C18 chain itself, very close to the silica. So we get the effect of binding the open space between the compound and the silica, but it also gives us an additional functionality that we can actually work with some of the polar compounds as well. As you can read here, usually we want to keep it below a pH of 7, just because of it is a silica-based column. The selectivity obviously can change, just like I mentioned before, with the different types of modifiers you're putting in here. Whether we have low pH or high pH, we can sort of play with this back and forth. The runs we're going to show you are run with 40 millimolar ammonium acetate. I think one or two maybe different, but the ionic strength has been kept constant, and methanol is used for most. Methanol is used as a buffer with the buffers because it's a little bit more soluble than acetonitrile. Scanning unit runs were used with all the chromatograms, and I will sort of get into that a little bit later once we get to some of the runs. I'll show you what that means. You can see here we have a bunch, well, technically this is 4, but I have 3 sets of chromatograms. The first 2 are acetaminophen and caffeine, very neutral compounds, not going to be doing anything different as we run from the C18 to the C18 WCX, whether we change the pH or modifier. We really don't see a whole lot of difference between the 2 types of separations. Retention times are very similar on both. Same here with this. Now this is a universal test mix that comes with our instrumentation. There's 2 compounds in there, and as you can see, there really isn't much difference in them either. Doesn't matter what pH we run at or the which column we use. However, so you'll notice that the pKa of the benzoic acid is about 4.27. So when we're at 3.8, you'll notice that we get no peak shape. Well, if we use no modifier, we get no resolution, no nothing with the WCX. It's really bound on there, and it just is a really poor eluting compound. Once we do put some modifier in there and actually get the pH of the mobile phase down quite a bit, we have a very strongly retained compound. Even though it's somewhat polar, we're still going to be a lot longer retained than we would be on the traditional C18 column. If we go up to the middle pHs, you'll see that we start to get some distortion of our peak on the WCX column. We still have some resolution here, but it's not great. Again, here really doesn't affect a whole lot, just maybe a little bit of our retention time, but we're still keeping our peak shape relatively normal on the C18. So you can see that the additional functionality on the WCX column adds to our separation and not just added retention. This is a lidocaine with a pKa of 7.9. As you notice, it affects the retention times greatly based on the pH, but we're in a lot closer. So we're not getting retained as well on the WCX as we are on the traditional C18. So in some cases, it's going to benefit us. Some cases, it's actually not going to help us, and it'll actually make the affinity for the compound a little bit less. Pranolol, which is even a little bit higher, running these at different pHs, again, we go back to a situation where we have no peak at all. It's just basically a big blob, kind of from both, but much worse on the WCX column. Once we do buffer down to 3.8, again, from there on down, we're keeping the pH constant, or the retention time constant, even as we change the pHs. However, on the WCX, it does give a little bit of a retention change based on the pH, so we are affecting that interaction with the acid on the base structure of this C18 on the WCX column. Next, different type of analysis, and this is a multi-compound analysis that we decided to do. I'm now transitioning more into the SFC stage of the webinar. So what we did is we took a couple of traditional compounds that you might see in pharma. The phenacetin is actually one of our universal test mix compounds, and as well as the M-benzylbenzamide. So these two are actually our universal test mix. But we have some, all the compounds have nitrogen groups. Some of them have acid groups. Some of them have sulfur groups. So we get a lot of different polarity, a lot of different interactions going on. And it'll give you a feeling for a broad classification of compounds and how they interact individually on the SFC compared to reverse phase or normal phase. You can see here, I have two sets of data points for you. We have the reverse phase and normal phase data in the top spreadsheet, if you will. And the lower spreadsheet is going to be what we obtained from some of the SFC data that we ran on the same exact compounds. So you'll notice that we have the Redicept C18R reverse phase and then the Redicept silica in the normal phase. Then on the SFC, we ran some of the same columns, but mostly we ran basically silica as a basis for all the runs that we've done. A diol WCX, 4EP, diamino, and the Redicept PEI. You'll notice that where the alpha, or I should say the retentions were increased, or the K primes were increased, we've notated them in green. And where the K primes have been reduced, they've turned red. And I've sort of given some indications on the individual runs as well. C18 with all of those compounds, some of them didn't look so great. We have some broad peaks that really didn't sharpen up very well. Again, here's the conditions up here where we're running with water and methanol. Some of the peaks were very long retained. A lot of the peaks were broad. No real complete resolution on any of the normal phase on a silica. Obviously, we ran in the opposite direction. We have some peaks here in the beginning that were a little bit broad, but a bunch of the other compounds came out here on all clustered together in one big large group. So what does that mean if we run that on SFC? Well, is it going to change anything? Is it going to look exactly an analytical run using the same silica stationary phase? But as you can see in the SFC, we got full resolution just by changing over to a methanol and CO2 mobile phase. So it completely changed the chromatography. So for us to say that there's a direct correlation between either reverse phase or normal phase to SFC, there really isn't one. So that's why we went through this whole process to give you an indication of all the different types of columns that are out there and see how each of these individual columns compare and contrast to the traditional silica column, which is what we send instruments. You'll notice that a diol didn't really change too much. We had a little bit more retention on the later eluting peaks. We did get one set of compounds here in the middle that sort of co-eluted. So one of those compounds actually moved a little bit, as you can see. Got a little bit more resolution here on these three because we did get actually a little bit more affinity on the column. CX, which I personally didn't think we would really be able to see much of that running that on SFC because I've never really had any luck with C18 columns on SFC. But it turns out it actually worked out quite well. And we actually had this front peak moved in a little bit. The back peak moved out quite a bit. And we got full resolution on the peaks in the middle. So it was able to help us sort of like branch this whole entire set of compounds out and fan them out a little bit better. I want to do a lot more work with this, so I'm going to be probably doing something on this in one of our upcoming webinars as well. Notice here that the 4-ethylpyridine We had one compound come back a little bit, but we actually had some compounds change elution completely. And what does this mean for us? Well, with a 4-ethylpyridine, we might be able to change some elution orders. If we had a compound maybe that on silica, our main impurity is on the front edge of our main compound. If we do something and maybe run it on the ethylpyridine, we may be able to flip some of the affinity and actually have that compound come out behind the our main component, and it'll help us with some of the separation to get a more pure first component. The diamino column, you'll see that again we had a merge here of the same two compounds, but with the amino column, some of these compounds really pulled way out into the chromatogram. The first compound obviously came forward a little bit, so looks pretty good to me. So I would actually look at this as some of these compounds being very similar, have this affinity for the amino groups, would wind up sticking on and basically pulling out a lot. PEI column is a very large structure, and it just really moved things all over the place. The first peak here in this cluster is actually the last peak. The first peak becomes the last peak up here. So it shifted a lot of things around. Unfortunately, we did not get separation on this. So put into my toolbox. Well, typically I will leave the silica in there because it's the simple industry standard for testing out columns. Secondly, I would put in here with its broad selectivity, I would use the PEI column, and you can see the references down here. So with the PEI column, you'll notice that we had a complete reversal of elutions. So the early compounds came out earlier. The late compounds came out even later. We actually didn't even get an elution with the diazole compound, and we did some work on some compounds later that'll give you an indication as to why that might be. So I would definitely have that in there as well. The 4-ethylpyridine is a very up-and-coming column. A lot of people use it for doing achiral purifications. If you look down here on the chart, the ethylpyridine is right here in the middle. It's just a little bit more retained for everything. So everything was a little bit more retained than it would be on the silica column. So it'll give you a little bit more affinity for most compounds. The diamino would be my fourth column. Just because there's some things we can do with it because of the amine groups on there. However, I had to amend this a little bit, and I would actually say maybe a fourth column could be a WCX column, or something else that maybe if you have a specific separation that you work with your column manufacturer or send to us, maybe we can work with it and come up with a column that'll work best for you. But typically those would be the first three plus one of the last two would be the columns that I would put into my system. Our SFC actually has 6 positions, so I would probably put all 5 in there and leave the 6th position as a bypass. Purification that was done by my colleague Jack. So what it was is just basically a relatively small lipid purification. Part of the delivery system for some of your mRNA vaccines, and including COVID vaccines. But the mass is not super large, but it's still a pretty large molecule. First, look at this in reverse phase, flash. So to make it easier, we just ran it on our flash column. And as you can see, we have run these with mass specs, so we can definitely identify where the compound is. So right here's the flash run with a traditional, regular reverse phase flash, which should be a C18 column. Very strong retention. We wound up doing what I mentioned earlier is as far as a scouting run. So we run a very steep gradient, then hold it, and then see where that comes off. And because of where it's at, it targeted a very high organic elution. So we went from 90 to 100% based on the software. And it gave us just a very broad peak from 8 to 12 minutes. From that run, we also had a lot of tailing material coming off. It really didn't come off altogether. So my suspicion is it's really interacting heavily with the siloxanes of the stationary phase as well as with the C18 grouping itself. And did an amine on a normal phase run. So we basically did the complete opposite. We went with a organic mobile phase. So as you can see here, it was DCM and methanol using an amine column, and it just basically came out in the void. There was impurity wasn't even apparent in the chromatogram. We did again another scout run, did a very shallow gradient, very low. I think it was from 5 to 25, and we still barely had any retention on it. So in that case, we don't really want to consider this as a good separation either. See, well, similar thing, the silica column, we got a very long retention. We have one impurity up here. This is our main compound. So we at least have them fully resolved, but this compound is really broad, smeared. So what Jack decided to do is he spiked the mobile phase with a little bit of ammonia to try and bring that peak in to one solid peak, and it did help. We were able to run this on a very shallow gradient, sharpened up the peak, but we still have a very poor peak shape. So if this impurity was a lot closer to the main component, we would still have problems trying to separate it. But we do have a full separation. Now, maybe a diamino column, we might actually see something like this, where we have a full resolution, relatively, and this is a fast gradient from, as you can see, it's SFC, so we're going up to 70%. We have full resolution on a fast gradient run. If we wanted to really get this isolated and get these drawn apart, we could do, again, like we said, is stretch this out with a scouting run and get a much larger separation. So within 5 minutes, we were able to get both the impurity and the main compound in a very nice sharp peak. We don't have to worry about using DCM. There's no additives. So just by changing our stationary phase to the diamine column, we fully resolved this without any buffers or modifiers or anything else to cause a problem with the separation. So, what are the things that we've learned today? So there's way too many columns out there to really consider if you're going to be running both reverse phase, normal phase, and SFC. But when you're running SFC, you're going to get the most possible columns to evaluate. We evaluated some of the mobile phase conditions that you might consider to improve chromatography. We looked at both normal and reverse phase examples. The samples we've shown were all on the Redisite SFC columns. So if you need any more information about those, by all means, reach out to us. We can help you work through with what columns might be best for your SFC separations as well. And we did a comparative analysis to show that really isn't any direct correlation between reverse phase and normal phase to SFC, but we can get some ideas. Ultimately, as with all chemistry and all science, it's just a matter of working through and doing experiments to figure out what's best. And with SFC, that tends to be screening multiple columns and just seeing what happens to give you the best separation. So now that we're done, I'm going to transition into our questions phase. And, I've left here with my QR code so that you can go ahead and link to me on LinkedIn if you'd so like. If you want to get a hold of me, there's my email address, and Sharon and or Josh, if you contact our marketing team or our product manager, they'll be more than happy to get you in touch with me. So I'm going to open it up now to a handful of questions that we had submitted. I'll go ahead and hit the first one. So what if you have a compound that is both acidic and basic? I kind of think I mentioned something about that earlier in the run, but you could actually do what we call ion pairing. So you could actually put an acid and a base modifier in there. Or what you may try and do is try and push your mobile phase in a certain direction so that you make sure that the compound is either protonated or deprotonated based on what your particular column is, and maybe go for the pKa of the compound that is the most, say, complicated or the most hard to resolve. Or possibly choose a column like we did with the amino column where you don't have to worry about having the buffering on both sides. Another thing I was speaking with someone today on SFC about was with SFC, it's slightly acidic to begin with. So if you do put a basic modifier into your mobile phase stream, the only thing you have to deal with at the end of the run is just simply the basic modifier, whether it's triethylamine or some other type of basic additive. Question number 2, is SFC the same as normal phase? And I get that a lot because it's actually a good question. A lot of people will ask that because if we're running methanol, we're typically using the same columns that we're using for normal phase, but because we have the CO2 in there, it's not exactly the same. So we can get different separations, as you saw with some of the compounds we ran. They didn't look at all like what we saw on the normal phase run. So because we do have the acidity in there with the CO2, because we're dealing with a totally different structure, the CO2 actually does have a dipole to it. So even though it's neutral and similar to a hexane, it's sure to say nonpolar in itself. It does have actually a dipole, so there's some weird interactions that happen with the CO2. So it's not really normal phase or reverse phase, and it's sort of is treated as its own kind of chromatography. A question: Can you load the same on columns in both SFC, normal phase, or HPLC? Loading is a little bit different between all three. Normal phase chromatography, typically you're going to be able to load a lot more because of the solvents you're working with. I typically see people doing more grams of separation per injection on normal phase. HPLC, we're looking at anywhere from milligrams to maybe a gram, depending upon the size of the column. Again, everything boils down to the size of your column. But as a technique, normal phase is usually going to be a little bit higher loading capacities. And then it's just not going to be as pure, and you will have as high purity. But SFC is going to be a little bit on the lower side of loading, simply because we're running at such higher flow rates. The retention times are much shorter, so you can typically have higher throughputs, even though you're loading less per injection. Is the WCX and AQ columns the same? I kind of alluded to it, but I may not have gone into that as much as I should have. They're not the same. So the WCX, we do have the acidic grouping very low on the C18 chain, whereas instead of modifying the chain as we do with the WCX, an AQ column, we will modify the silica. So it'll have something coming off the silica. Either it'll be a very high carbon load silica where we bind something to the siloxanes so that they're just not there available to interfere with your separation. It should be that. Did you do any large protein work with any of these columns? I know Jack has done a lot of work with proteins, carbohydrates. We're trying to do some different things. And with that, we've actually been able to see customers using a little bit of water to help with some of those purifications, because that's one of the biggest problems, is trying to maintain solubility of a lot of those compounds when running SFC. So we're trying to look into that, and I think there might be some webinars coming down the line that my colleagues are going to do. I'm not really as big into the protein purification as they are, so they're going to be doing a lot more of that work. And that goes to the next question, ironically. Have you used water in your mobile phase for SFC? And I will go ahead and end the webinar for today. Thank you so much again for everyone for attending, and I appreciate the time that you took out of your day to go ahead and be with us. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to or Sharon. I'm not sure who's going to take us out to the end of the webinar. But if you would like to get in touch with us, here are the different locations that you can: Facebook, X, LinkedIn, YouTube. So all these webinars that we do will actually eventually end up on YouTube. And I'll probably also post on my LinkedIn, and Teledyne will also post onto our company page with all the different webinars that we have available. And for joining us, and look forward to see you the next time. Thanks. Have a great afternoon.